This video is covering seam allowance. This is a basic sloper pattern, so I need to do a few things to it before I add seam allowance. One of those, if I have a dart, instead of just a regular t-shirt armhole, if I have a dart, I need to close the dart before I can add seam allowance if I want it to be a regular dart. And I would go up to Dart, Fold, and then it says select dart on the side to fold to, and because I want the markings on the pattern, I'm including the fold lines and the notches. But if I do that, I don't need the drill hole. So I'm selecting the dart on the side that I want it to fold to. If I choose the wrong side and have it fold up, then I ruin my fabric usage. So I'm going to undo that and go back to that one again. That's fold, darts fold, advanced darts fold. So the side that I want it to go to, I've still got my notches and my lines included. I'm going to choose the side that folds it down, and then I get a nice looking dart right there. And you can see there's a notch under the line and the middle, and I've got the markings that I need. So now that I have that in that condition, I can go ahead and add seam allowance to it. And while I'm here, I'm going to do the same thing with my back shoulder dart. Okay, so I can do all of my pieces at once. This is a blouse with a sleeve and a collar. So I go up to Advanced, Define, and if I want to add seam allowance to all of them at once, I can go back and change minor things or individual seams like hems, and I'm just going to choose the whole thing. I could do it that way and then change it, or I could deselect anything that's going to be different. And if I want to put one of these on the fold eventually, I don't want seam allowance down the front or back, and since this is a blouse, I don't want seam allowance down the center back, so I deselected that. And I don't need it there either. Okay, so I've chosen everything that I want seam allowances on. It's highlighted in my highlight color. Mine is red. Seam type, I want it to be even, and so I chose it. Now I need to say OK, and the seam allowance amount, I'm going to use 3/8 for everything, 0.375. You use whatever seam allowance you need. Well, I just put it on and they don't show because I have this little button pushed down here that's hide seams in blue. So when I deselect that, it appears. It should have appeared in the first place, but I had already pushed that button. So if I want to hide all of my seams at the same time, as long as my stitching line, my dotted line, my internal line is showing on the outside, I can hide the seams and it's not going to hurt anything. But if I do that and I'm not thinking about the seams and I have that swapped, that could cause me some problems. So before you send something to the cutter to cut it out, you want to hide your seam allowance. And I'm going to come back to the hem in just a minute and talk about different seam finishes. But I can come up here to Advanced, and instead of Define, I can go to Swap. So I'm choosing all of them. I'm going to say OK. So I have some problems. For the video, I'm going to go ahead and say OK. And then you can see what happens if I don't see any major ones, but we might be seeing some seam allowance width changes there. So I swapped them, and now the dotted line is on the inside. So when I turn off hide seams, it's going to take off. I can't see where my stitching lines are anymore, and the outer edge includes the seam allowance. And I know sometimes we're used to seeing it that way. As long as you know the seams are on there and you're making your decisions, that's fine. But make sure you know which way it is. So I usually am in the habit of having the seam allowance off, so I would go and swap that. And I can leave my seam allowance intact there and just hide it and make changes and make measurements. But if I do the reverse and I have, for example, verify line length, if I have some of these lines highlighted with their measurements, well, those will turn off. And I look at them, 5 and 3, 8 in my armhole. If I unhide the seams, and if we just remember one of them, this is 5.09, and I come up to advance and I swap all of those and I'm not paying attention, I say okay, well that line measures at 9, 5.09 still. But if I hide my seams and I come back in and choose my line length, I'll be getting different answers. And then when I unhide my seams, well, that's a good thing, they both show. But you need to keep in mind where your seam allowance is and what it's doing when you've got it on there. So I want that, and I would swap it back if I were making pattern changes. But you can see how I've got all of my seam allowances where they need to be. I have a grading problem happening right here. Probably I've got a point too close. Oh no, that's okay. There's just an intermediate point that's showing. Okay, so all of my seam allowances match, and I need to do my hems. So we went over how to add seam allowance, and that's verify, define. And you can choose them all at once, or you can do one line at a time. So if I changed my mind about this seam and I went to define and I decided that this seam needed to be more, I could change that. If I wanted a folded facing that was self-faced, I could change that to 3 inches. But because it was on the inside, that didn't work. So let's try that again. Define, select the line, well, that doesn't look right. So I have a copy of the original up here, and it isn't. So why isn't it? So I'm going to undo. My seam is back where it belongs, and it matches my original. So if I swap the seam allowance on this, and then I come up to define, and I choose this line, and I enter 3 inches, that might be outside of its total, then it does it correctly. So if I'm going to redefine my seam allowances, I want to swap the seams again so that the information doesn't go negative. It went positive, where before you were seeing it going negative into the inside of the piece. and there's my original, and it's still correct. So if I were really doing something like that, I'd want notches there, and I wouldn't want to do it as a seam allowance. Okay, so I can also change that and add the hem, and I'm going to leave this one with it not swapped, and this one, well, this one has the stitching line inside, and this one has the solid line inside. So those are different. Now when I define, and I want to put a 1-inch hem at the, oh, I keep doing that. I want to define just this line on both of them. And if I put in a 1-inch hem, because it's swapped, this one went outside and this one went inside. So when you're working with your seam allowance, you have to swap back so that the stitching line is a solid line and the seam allowance is a dotted line. Now this is all true unless you have digitized your piece in with seam allowance already added. So we'll come back to that thought. Okay, so this is the correct one. I can now swap this, and it's what I want it to be. And this one, what happens if I swap that? Well, that's just not right. So I'm going to remove this seam allowance and put it back to 0. And if I really want to fix that, then I need to come back and swap it so that my stitching line is inside, and then I can add my 1-inch seam allowance. It says select PO. So now I can choose that one and say 1. And now they match. And then I can swap it back. And now these two pieces match. I could flip them over on top of each other and double check too. But because I've got my seam allowance there, okay, I can hear some questions you're asking, because the question is, what if I digitized it and it already had seam allowance on it? So I'm going to come back and use this piece and pretend that I did that. So if I finish this thought and I flip this piece over, and I need to show you how to pre-miter the corner on that next seam. So modify flip piece around this line, say OK, and I need to line this up. And ordinarily I would use set rotate to line pieces up like this, but I can't because there's not something to line it up with. So I'm lining it up with the, oh yes there is, okay. So I want to line this up, modify set rotate, and I want this to be my piece. I want to line it up on that line, and I want that piece sitting on top, and then I'm going to say cancel so that it goes into the original position. And we need to pre-miter off this corner in order for it to run through the factory smoothly. So I'm making it large so I can see it clearly. I'm going to go back to my advanced seam, and I'm going to go to corners. I could use miter, but I don't have as much control with that. So I'm going to use double miter corner because this is a crooked corner. Select the corner to make a double miter corner. You want to choose the one that's sticking out. And then this starts moving. And because that line's moving, I'm going to come down to where it joins that point. And then the other line is going to move. So this is a two-part thing. And then touch. And then it just automatically cuts it off to match. So I'm going to do that again. And I'm going to leave it out a little bit so it's easier to see. So when you have a corner that sticks out beyond the edge, it's easy for the sewers to make a mistake and actually sew it together like this and then they don't match up here on the shoulder line. So this is a really important thing to take care of. So we're going back to Advanced Seam Corners, double miter, select a corner, and once you select that corner, the line starts moving, and you're going to set it down on the one edge that you want to cut off. And then I'm just moving my mouse. I'm not touching it yet. I'm just moving it, and then I touch and it cuts it off. And then you say OK, and the corner is pre-mitered. If you don't like that sitting crooked, then you just come up to Modify, Realign, Realign Piece, touch the piece, and then it flipped back over. And this one that was extended out further has pre-mitered. And it automatically apparently was set to add notches right there. So if I were to go back to Advanced Corners, double miter, I've got perpendicular notches added, and most of the time I go with none, so I should have selected none, and then there wouldn't have been any notches added there. You could also experiment with clip to line. Okay. So I want to look at hems and regular mitering on these two pieces. So if this is a pointy collar, I don't need it to come out that far. For this one, I've already got my seam allowance added. It's swapped. It's okay that it's swapped. I could do it either way. This time I'm just going to go to mitered, and I'm going to choose a corner to make it mitered. Well, now this is only moving in one direction instead of two, and I just want to pull that back so I have 1/4 of an inch seam allowance and it's protected. But I could cut it off shorter, but that's the way a regular mitered corner works. And now just to show you what it would look like if I were to swap the seam allowance back to the original, I can come in and swap all of those, and it still shows that corner out there mitered, and it shows this corner mitered on the stitching line. Then if I want to make changes to my piece, I'm going to hide the seams. So until I send it out for cutting, I usually leave all of my seams not swapped, and when it's approved to go and have markers made, then I'll swap my seams and do a last double check before it gets sent to cutting. Okay. I'm going to swap all of those back though. Alright, so the sleeve, the last thing, the fairly simple one, if I come up here to corners and I come down to a mirrored corner or a turn back corner, I mean, you've got all kinds of different corners that you can do from this point. But a turn back or a mirrored corner is going to be similar. But I'm going to use a turn back right now. So select the line to apply the turn back. So if I had added a 1-inch seam there in advance, well, it's swapped, so it went the wrong way. So I need to undo that and swap the piece. Then I need to add 1 inch right here. So now I'm going to go up to corner and use a turn back corner and select, this is my line, and it automatically fixed the corner. So it has little ears on it and it folds up nicely. Okay, so what happens if you digitize this in and it already has seam allowance on it? Well, in order to pretend that it already has seam allowance on it, and this would have a notch up here if I had done it correctly, in order to pretend that you've already digitized it in, it looks this way, but the seam allowance isn't added yet, I'm going to define and touch, okay, all of the pieces and say 0. And so now the seams, if I were to save this at this point, so I'd go up to File, Save, I'd save it without seam allowance. That is now going to be a piece acting like it has no seam allowance. And if I just come up to Define and add seam allowance to these pieces, it adds more to the outside. So I'm increasing their size. That's not something I typically want to do. So keep track of it if you've done that. So I've got this piece, this style that I've just digitized in. It already has seam allowance attached to it. Somebody has thought that through. You just digitized the outer edge of the seam. And I knew it. There is a grading problem right there, but that's because of what I did to the seam allowance. That wouldn't be there if you digitized it. Okay, so now we have no seam allowance on the piece, and you need to see your seam allowance. So I'm going to come up to Define, and I'm going to touch all of the parts that have seam allowance, but I'm going to deselect all of the lines that I don't want to do this to. Okay, so those are all of the lines that are different, and I deselected them, and you see them in white. So I've chosen the whole rest of all the pieces, and this time, because I used 3/8 last time, I'm going to put in -0.375. If you digitized in a commercial pattern, you could use 0.625. But now my seam allowances are back, and they're in the same place. And then I could come and choose my hems and say -1. And this one, and -3. So as long as you know what your seam allowances were before you digitized it in, you can add it as a negative number, and then you could save it. And once you've done that, you could swap it and take the seam allowance off. I did something wrong there. Swap. Nope, apparently it won't. Oh, there it went. So it did take the seam allowance off, except for this piece. I must not have pushed the right. I must not have touched it. So if you digitize it in, you can still show your seam allowance and remove it as seam allowance if you use a negative number. And if you digitize it without seams, then you can just treat it like a regular pattern piece. Let me know if you have questions.